Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan, and we're back with The American Left, From Liberalism to Despotism. We're on to lecture number 7 today, The Sexual Revolution.
In this lecture, Dr. Slack explains the roots of what we see today as the LGBT movement. At least one suspects that we see it because you can't turn on your TV or go on social media or go to a store, particularly in June, without having radical sexual ideology pushed in front of you. Dr. Slack explains how this movement evolved, where it is today. This is a tough lecture to listen to because it's ugly and it's sad, but it's very important to know where this came from and where it's going.
So to help you better understand these topics, we've created these online courses, and we obviously have put them now on podcast. But we are a college after all, and we also have a lot of material that you can read. You might be familiar with our monthly speech digest called Imprimis. It goes out to 6.4 million people across the country. And there's a few issues that are recent that deal with this very topic of the sexual revolution. One is by Abigail Schreier on gender ideology run amok. And most recently, Clay Travis wrote one on sports should unify, not divide us, but it deals with the problem of transgenderism in sports today. And so to read those, you can go to hillsdale.edu/read, R-E-A-D. That's hillsdale.edu/read.
And now we turn to Professor Slack for Lecture 7, The Sexual Revolution.
This lecture on the sexual revolution will begin with how the liberals viewed sex in society, and the permissive view that they had, but also how it was constraining of sexual expression. We'll then move to different movements, gay liberation, then transgenderism, and finally the contradictions that arose at the time and that we see present in American society today. The liberals are very much informed by Freud's view of sexuality. Freud dominated American culture. He rose to the fore of American journals in the 1920s. And Freud was seen as providing the authoritative view of the human mind. Freud's argument was, as human beings were bisexual by nature, meaning they were born bisexual, but that the objects of their attachments, those they were attracted to, were formed in their childhood development. Freud had argued that repression was the basis of civilization, and that the pleasure principle, or the human desire for pleasure, as it rose up in human development, in the oral, the anal, the phallic, the latent, and the genital erotogeneic zones, repression in each of those zones was necessary so that the libido or energy could eventually be directed to heterosexual monogamous families, and that these families repress sexuality, directing sexuality to certain institutions that made civilization possible. And so, in modern civilization, where human beings were so repressed sexually, the problem is the ego began to break down under the strain. And so Freud introduces the talking cure that we've mentioned before. Ultimately, those who undergo psychoanalysis would be able to renounce the objects of their desire and even sublimate that sexual energy towards other channels, things like science or literature and creation in the arts. The 1950s Americans adopted what has been called the permissive society. What it meant was a lot of discussion about sex, but not so much in terms of acting out on sexual desire. At the most radical, we find the rise of Playboy, the magazine, and this interminable series of essays by Hugh Hefner on the Playboy philosophy. Helen Gurley Brown writes Sex and the Single Girl in 1961. That was the basis for Sex and the City of the 1990s. Today, we're such a coarse society. If you try to watch Sex and the Single Girl, the movie, I think that was 1966 or 67, Tony Curtis, Lauren Bacall, it's almost unwatchable. There are all these double entendres and references to sex that seem somewhat naive. We've also seen how Freud's student Wilhelm Reich would challenge Freud's ideas on the necessity of repression in civilization. Reich, who also influenced Herbert Marcuse, Norman O. Brown, and Paul Goodman, he argued rather that repression, now that human beings had created industrial production and civilization, repression actually brought about the very neuroses that psychoanalysis would claim to resolve. In fact, it bred the fascist personality. Reich argued that there ought to be a full sexual liberation. He meant that children ought to be encouraged to explore, particularly once they hit the genital phase. Young children ought to be able to explore themselves, figure out what they like sexually, and then they would not attach their libido to these abstract identities, again, a leader cult or the symbol of a national flag, that would also channel aggressive impulses, the product of repression, towards others in war. Reich also foresaw a new kind of society. He called it work democracy. What that meant was once human beings were liberated from sexual repression, they would enjoy working. They would take on jobs that helped them fulfill themselves as people. He said that the ideal jobs would be the equivalent of a good orgasm in all aspects of life, and that people who were sexually liberated would refuse to work boring jobs that were monotonous, that stripped them of their rights to personal identity. Reich also suggested that there would be a new elite class of scientists, and they were the ones in understanding human sexuality that could help to rule all others by pleasure, and they could direct pleasure by helping human beings to develop naturally, as opposed to the old moral codes, the sexually ascetic codes that repress them and then channel these emerging aggressive impulses in the wrong direction. And so there's a tension right at the outset of Reich's theory, and that's between this idea of scientific control by pleasure versus the commodification of sex. That's something Herbert Marcuse pointed out. Marcuse argued that the sexual liberation could best be described as two young lovers making love in a field, as opposed to the capitalist commodification of sex that he saw happening in the world around him in the 1960s. The liberals then celebrated sexual permissivity, but again with a form of renunciation. If you look at commercials of the time, movies or television shows, there are all kinds of allusions to sex, but they were challenged by more radical thinkers at the end of the 50s and throughout the 1960s. One of the effects was to make obscenity or sexual expression so narrow a legal category as to make it almost non-existent. This occurs in several cases. One of them is the Roth case. It's in this case where the Supreme Court sets up a new standard for obscenity. The old one was the Hicklin test, and this one was created in the late 19th century. It was that any kind of sexual expression that tends to subvert the morals, particularly of women and children, would be deemed obscene and could be prosecutable. In the Roth case, the Supreme Court creates a new test, which is that something is obscene if it appeals solely to the prurient interest and has no redeeming literary or artistic merit. This opened up a loophole that lawyers immediately seized upon. What if something did appeal to the prurient interest, but like the writings of D.H. Lawrence, could also be argued to have redeeming, artistic, and literary merit? And so through this loophole, lawyers were able to admit all kinds of works that had been banned for years as being of social importance, even if most of society called them obscene. A very interesting case here is Memoirs v. Massachusetts of 1966. The question was whether an old novel, Fanny Hill, Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, written all the way back in 1749, was obscene or not. In that book, there's a young woman who wanders into the city and has a whole host of sexual experiences as a movement towards her understanding of herself and authenticity. The interesting question in the case is who should decide whether Fanny Hill was obscene or not as a novel? And in the case, you have those in the court who say that the state legislature, the representatives of the people, should make that moral determination. Rather, the court would decide that it should be experts in literature or experts in the arts who would determine that merit. And of course, it's always easy to find a professor who will say almost anything is of literary merit. What's also interesting in the case is that William O. Douglas, one of the Supreme Court justices, would add in an appendix a sermon that was written by a Universalist minister. And in that sermon, the argument is that Fanny Hill, who explores her sexuality, is actually the hero, a hero of authenticity, as opposed to the moralistic prudes who double down on sexual restraint and repression. Douglas would say of the court, "We are not judges, not literary experts or historians or philosophers." And that would mean that an expert class of academics would now decide what was right, what was moral for society. The change that takes place in American society is vast and it's very quick. In 1965, the Academy Award Best Picture went to The Sound of Music. In 1969, it went to Midnight Cowboy, about a young Texas buck who goes to New York to become a prostitute. That was the first X-rated film, the only X-rated film I'm aware of, that would win an Academy Award for Best Picture. And so there's an elite revolt against the old morality. This is also part of the new knowledge economy. an estimated 30% of the jobs in 1970 that young college graduates were moving into. It also meant a new model of the family. It would mean room for personal experiences and investigation as to what might make one happy. The sexual revolution lifted the constraints on free and consenting adults. It also meant that pornography invades popular American culture. By the 1970s, the early 70s, there were some 70 pornography cases on the Supreme Court docket. What was the Supreme Court going to determine was obscene or not? You can imagine the situation, a bunch of old men having to go down to the Supreme Court basement and watch porno flicks. Eventually, one of the justices said, "I'm simply not going to do this. Virtually, there's nothing that will be deemed obscene. All is free under the First Amendment." Finally, it came to a head with the Burger Court in 1973. In the case Miller v. California, this is where community standards were added. This added a third component to the Supreme Court's test for obscenity. It meant that a community, say a grand jury, would decide whether something was beyond the pale. It meant that in major cities, you could still be prosecuted for obscenity, but in some parts of the country it was much more difficult, depending on how permissive they were liberal. If you went to a large city like San Francisco, there was the red light district, but most of the buildings, or many of the buildings, would have a title, an arts theater, and that would justify any of the obscenity going on there. Concerning homosexuality and the movement for gay liberation, Christianity and the Christian tradition for some 2,000 years recognized homosexuality as a sin, not just because it violated scripture and church teaching, but also because it was antithetical to nature. The idea is that human sexual desire was an unruly desire, and so was best channeled into the institution of the family, which was best for the individuals involved for their personal happiness, but also what was good for society and social happiness. For our purposes, what's interesting is that many of the founders of the Enlightenment agreed with this. For example, John Locke argued that sodomy runs against the intention of nature. Immanuel Kant, another Enlightenment thinker, argued that in homosexual relations, one of the participants takes on the identity of a tool or an object for the sexual pleasure or the mastery of another. This didn't just apply to homosexuals, it applied to heterosexuals. Any form of sodomy was then a violation of Kant's ethical principles. And so Kant equated homosexuality with a form of mastery or aggression. It's hard for us to imagine in a romantic movie a female heroine being sodomized by a male at the end of the movie. The problem for Kant, who disapproved of sodomy in all cases, was for homosexuals there was no alternative, that this was the only form of sexual relation they could engage in. How did this apply across the Atlantic in the United States? Most of the states had laws against homosexuality or sodomy. However, it was rare for the government to get involved in private cases. In the founding Republican era, they viewed the family to be a realm of privacy. And so the government, the magistrates, only became involved in activities that were on public display or that affected the family. For example, a case of adultery, where there was a tremendous drop in the prosecutions for fornication after the Revolutionary period, we still find prosecutions for adultery because it involved children and affected the family. The liberals' view of homosexuality was very much influenced by Freud. Liberals believed that homosexuals were not immoral, rather they had been educated to be homosexual in character development and how they were raised. And so in the liberal understanding, homosexuality was a mental illness. This also meant that liberal parents buying Benjamin Spock, who was somewhat of an interpreter of Freud, were terrified about little peccadillos in raising their children when it came to toilet training or breastfeeding. The idea is you may have a greedy, hoarding, anal retentive adult because you as a parent were faulty in raising your child in toilet training. The same could be applied to homosexuality. They thought that homosexuals, there was something wrong in their development, and so it was a mental illness. This was very much the popular view. If you look at documentaries in the 1960s, Mike Wallace, the famous reporter, did a whole episode on the homosexuals in 1967 with the idea of the seedy homosexual underworld. There's another documentary, Boys Beware, from 1961, about homosexuals who are sick, who drive around, cruising around looking for young boys to groom. So this was the popular interpretation. Homosexuals in the McCarthy era, and what scholars now call the Lavender Menace, were often equated with those who were mentally weak, who could be subjected to communist blackmailing. Eisenhower set new standards for civil servants and banned homosexuality in the bureaucracy. There were thousands of homosexuals fired. Usually this proceeded after the fashion that D.C. police would discover two men in an act of lewdness. They would then be given the choice of being fired from their jobs or outed, and so they would choose the former. Liberal homosexuals often viewed their lifestyle as being something different and found something of a satisfaction in not participating in the norm. It was not rare to come across homosexuals in Hollywood or in academia or in bureaucracy. They often viewed their sexual choice as participating in an adventuresome lifestyle that freed them from the drudgery of a monogamous family life. The radicals pushed back on this. Obviously, homosexuals in the liberal era wanted to be free from threats to their jobs or being fired for being gay. But the radicals made a different argument. Their argument is that the sexual deviations in, quote, gender identity were natural. They were not natural just in a statistical way. There's an obvious fact that there are homosexuals in society. And in that sense, almost any human activity is natural. But also that homosexuality was ethical. It meant that there was something preferable about the homosexual lifestyle. Herbert Marcuse argued that one's sexuality was part of one's identity. Marcuse even compares in Eros and Civilization the homosexual to the philosopher. The philosopher is homoerotic. He likes to have discussions with other men. And the philosopher also challenges convention and the opinions of others. And in doing so, the philosopher rouses the hatred of the moralists in society. And Marcuse argued it was the same with homosexuals, and there was a natural affinity between the two. Carl Whitman's Gay Manifesto in 1969 connected sexual repression to various reproductive taboos. He argued that the taboos stemmed from human beings who were forced to procreate for the good of society, even if it stunted their individual growth. He wrote, quote, "Nature leaves undefined the object of sexual desire. The gender of that object is imposed socially."
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Dennis Altman's 1971 book, Homosexual, applied the concept of liberation to discover the, quote, polymorphous whole, which he borrows from Herbert Marcuse. He argued that the homosexual is actually healthier than the exclusive heterosexual. And the reason is that human beings should embrace all forms of sexuality, homosexual or heterosexual, even in themselves, and should not demand that they're exclusively one or the other. He said, a healthy identity is, quote, liberating that part of ourselves that we have repressed, and that we could achieve harmony with the repressed homosexual desires that are the source of hypermasculinity. He noted that American society was particularly what would be called homophobic in 1967, and that is they celebrated pioneers and cowboys, but it was very taboo in America. In a way, it was not in Europe to see men holding hands or involved in all-male relationships. Again, to quote Dennis Altman, one's sexuality is part of his, quote, total concept of identity, and it is almost impossible to eradicate it without doing damage to the whole personality. Quote, liberation will come only with a new morality and a revised notion of human nature. So the gay liberation movement that begins in the 1960s not only includes the idea of individual autonomy and living an authentic life, it also becomes part of a civil rights movement. How do gays understand themselves? Is their identity a source of group oppression? And so we move to a different phase of gay liberation. In 1964, Lars Ullerstam wrote a, quote, sexual bill of rights for the erotic minorities. He appealed to exhibitionists, pedophiles, homosexuals, and voyeurists, quote, erotic minorities of all categories unite. Paul Goodman and Dennis Altman listed gays as a civil rights category that could be equated with blacks or with women as being an inferior caste. Coming out of the closet, Altman said, was a political statement, and it required not just an individual freedom, rather it required what he called gay world. It meant that homosexuals could create their own subculture, their own mannerisms. Homosexuals in the 1940s and 50s did not celebrate many of the expressions that would take off in gay communities in major cities. What were the forms of oppression that gays experienced, or the, quote, denial of their identity? Well, it took the form of persecution, discrimination, or liberal tolerance. And gay liberationists in the late 1960s argued that the last, liberal tolerance, was the worst because it included living with difference without fully validating it. And this leads to the next point. Gay liberation, as it became more radical, didn't equilibrate older morals. In other words, it didn't look at different moral choices and find tolerance for all of them. Rather, it inverted the older hierarchy. It became a, quote, attack on conventional morality. In the words of Carl Whitman, quote, exclusive heterosexuality reflects a fear of people of the same sex. It's anti-homosexual, and it's fraught with frustration. The, quote, guilt and self-hatred that had been reserved for homosexuals would now be reserved for those who were exclusively heterosexual. In 1967, George Weinberg coins the word homophobia, which he called a pathology. That was, quote, prejudice against homosexuality. And so here we see that all morality is aggression. All morality tends to a form of absolutism because it always involves claims made upon others. It's not just the case that you tolerate the moral opinions of somebody else. It's that you're making demands upon them to respect your own chosen way of life. It's not mere toleration. It requires actual praise, honor, and respect. Homosexuals disagreed with each other as to whether they should form separate communities or gay world, or whether they should crusade to eradicate both homosexual and heterosexual identities and their exclusivity. The Stonewall riots of 1969 were listed by Barack Obama as a major achievement in the civil rights movement. This is where gays fought the police for 3 straight days and is seen as being a major event where homosexuals are going to fight for their rights. In 1970, there were gay pride parades, the first of those kinds in 3 U.S. cities. By 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality as a mental pathology. The gay bathhouses had become radical chic in cities like New York, even for heterosexuals to attend. In transgenderism, one's sex does not align with socially prescribed gender roles. While radicals in Greenwich Village in the 1920s and 30s, often reading works from those who were radicals in Weimar Germany, had talked about sex changes and transgenderism. Transgenderism and sex changes were pioneered in the mid-60s. Probably the leading thinker was John Money. John Money pioneered hormone therapy. He argued that one's sex was determined by genetics, hormones, genitalia, and gender identity, and that the last took precedent over genitalia in shaping a patient's mental health. In 1965, Johns Hopkins started the first U.S. sex change program, the Gender Identity Clinic for Transsexuals. The doctors there told reporters that transsexuals were, quote, physically normal people who are psychologically the opposite sex. Plastic surgeon Dr. John Hoop said, quote, if the mind cannot be changed to fit the body, then perhaps we should consider changing the body to fit the mind. However, there were disagreements among the doctors themselves. It was unclear as to whether those who came to the clinic were better off after the surgery, and if the surgery itself was so questionable, why engage in it in the first place? The psychiatrist John Meyer, who joined the program in 1969, before he went on to publicly oppose it, argued that patients, quote, would start out talking about their wish for sex reassignment, but rapidly they moved to issues like loss, abandonment, and grief, the kinds of things they would bring up in a normal therapeutic session. Hoop recalled of the applicants, quote, we had quite a number of patients from the block, transvestites, gay men, strippers, just a bizarre group of people. Still, major media outlets or magazines called the operation a success. In 1972, the Boston Globe reported, quote, statistics have also shown that many transsexuals are indeed happier afterward, relieved of their frustrations, and able to lead lives of greater fulfillment. The magazine Jet reported, quote, change of sex operations are, quote, a necessary ingredient to a dynamic society. The problem with gender fluidity is that it ran up against the claims of feminist women who wanted to empower women. They opposed the idea that men who call themselves women should be allowed the same rights and prerogatives that women had crusaded for to achieve for themselves. In what we today call TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, there were women who openly opposed transsexuals. In 1979, Janice Raymond wrote the book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Males. She said, trans persons, quote, colonize feminist identification, culture, politics, and sexuality, and they appropriate female bodies. Her argument was that the identity of woman, the distinct gender of woman, ought to be preserved so that women could empower women. And when men claimed to be women, they colonized women and thereby subordinated themselves in a patriarchal society. Transgenderism as a movement takes off in the 1980s, although it had been around for some time. In 1987, Sandy Stone writes what has now become a classic in transgender literature, The Empire Strikes Back, here referring to the transsexual empire criticized by Raymond. This was the Transgender Manifesto. Here she argued that the trans discourse reproduced the same sexist norms, and that feminists participated in these binary identities that oppressed trans persons. Rather, it was non-trans people that had taken over the debate and the discussion, and that feminists only reintroduced the same oppressive binary categories, and therefore gender fluidity was antithetical to feminism itself as it was currently understood. This leads us to the ultimate contradiction of this non-binary world, and we see this today, where it's virtually impossible, even by Supreme Court justices, to say what a woman is. And then we have the assertions of female identity or female gender when it's useful politically. The whole point, one could argue, is that feminism, radical feminism, or the transgender movement is used for political control, that feminism itself was insufficient. If you look at the claims of the feminists, they were used for government interventions. For example, the destruction of the patriarchal family, an expansive government that can get involved in the relationships between parents and children to prevent any forms of oppression. Transgenderism has proven to be even more intrusive in terms of its ability to exercise control over persons' private lives. Here you have absolute strangers urinating and showering beside one another and are supposed to accept it. It means that you condition subjects to accept any invasion of their personal spaces. And if they do not, then they ought to feel bad and ashamed about themselves and their bigotry. And so now we see the trans invasion into areas that were exclusively reserved for women. Female athletics, female sports, wrestling, weightlifting, track and field, where you have males claiming to be females who are breaking female records in these areas. And the feminists, many of them, have sided with the trans movement and caved on the issue that they had crusaded for back in the 1970s. And so now what is demanded is not just toleration, but respect in this inversion of mores. It's often stated that political correctness is educating people not to notice. And now citizens are demanded, you are demanded, to look straight-faced into a male's eyes who claims he's a female, even if he has a functioning penis, and say that he is a woman. Even if he rapes others around them or sexually harasses women around him. This has been a recent example in the Illinois State Penitentiary. And so political correctness in teaching people not to notice basic distinctions among human beings actually turns out to be a form of intrusive political control. In the next lecture, we'll see how the radicals, in a long march to the institutions, were able to take over key agencies and commissions and institute their view of human liberation on the rest of American society.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about the history of the American left or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you will find 40 free online courses, including Constitution 101, The Real American Founding, American Citizenship and Its Decline with Victor Davis Hanson, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate of completion. All our courses are free because we believe that these subjects will help you in your pursuit for virtue and happiness, and because a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for happiness and freedom at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.